Hello and welcome to the Family Recovery Summit. My name is Karen Bernetti and I'm your host. Today, my special guest is Kathy Lang. Kathy is a retired social worker who's been facilitating online family and friends meetings for Smart Recovery for over 10 years. Her journey to working with families coping with the challenges of a loved one struggling with addictive behaviors was very personal. She's grateful that her loved one introduced her to SMART and gave her the opportunity to help other families learn to practice self-care, compassion, emotional self-management, appropriate boundaries, and improved communications. So one of the key takeaways I'm hoping our attendees get from this summit is that there are many pathways to recovery in a world that for the longest time I believed AlAnon was what's all there is. And AlAnon was a wonderful program for me. It really, really was. But I really had no idea that there was others out there. And SMART is definitely one of them. And so Kathy's here to tell us all about SMART. So welcome, Kathy. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank
you. We're happy to have you. Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself, your own journey, a little bit about your.
Sure. I have an adult son who, quite many years ago now, had major back surgery as a young guy in his early 20s, and he became addicted to oxycodone, which is a familiar story. And it was a very long and, as many families experience, painful journey. He is now in his 40s, and we have a beautiful 11-year-old granddaughter. And we were very fortunate that he reached sobriety. And I really, as you mentioned in the intro, I got connected to SMART, an organization I had really never heard about, through my son, because when he was in rehab, he was introduced to SMART, and he much preferred it over other traditional 12-step programs. And so I did a little research and found out about the program. And because I am a retired now social worker and had some knowledge of a cognitive therapy called rational emotive behavior therapy, which is the basic foundation for the SMART tools, I got very enthused. And at the time I got involved in SMART, what we did for family and friends was very, very rudimentary, meaning that I think we had one meeting online and a couple of fledgling in-person meetings around the country. And we've grown exponentially since then, I'm happy to say. And I think the reason for that is because we really look for evidence-based ways in which to encourage and help with recovery, both, of course, on the recovery side for our loved ones, but also that extends to family and friends. And so with all we've been learning about addiction and how to help families over the years, that's all incorporated into what we do in SMART Family and Friends. So I guess for lots of reasons, but part of it was kind of giving back. I was very fortunate that our son reached a recovery, and I felt that I wanted to get interested in growing the program at SMART for family and friends. And we do a significant number of online Zoom meetings now, as well as many meetings across the country face-to-face now that we're through the COVID epidemic. So I've learned a lot. I've been facilitating family and friends online for, like I said, about 10 years. And it's not only grown, but I've learned a great deal about how to best help with families in terms of what families need to take care of themselves and to help enrich the relationship with their loved one and be a support to their loved one. So, like a lot of other more traditional programs, of course, our first goal is to help families take care of themselves, meaning as individuals, they come to us. People are typically angry, frustrated, overwhelmed, feel like they're living on a roller coaster of emotions. It's a very painful place to be. So, of course, a great deal of our emphasis initially, especially, is self-care and ongoing self-care. I think what makes us different is that we recognize that although we can't control what happens with our loved one, meaning whether they choose and find recovery, we can be an influence. Whereas I think more traditional programs kind of begin and end with the self-care part. In other words, there's still a tremendous cultural bias out there, if you want to call it that. You still hear all of these things: let them hit rock bottom, detached, detach, there's nothing you can do about it. You just have to take care of yourself, save yourself. We know that recovery is not about detachment. It's really about attachment and connection. And so part of our approach is not only taking care of ourselves, but while we're doing that, figuring out what's the way in which we can support our loved ones the best way. And
what is that? What is
well,
that's the question we're asking all of our experts. How can we truly support our loved one in a truly meaningful way?
Okay, well, first of all, I think it's being self-aware as a beginning step of all the biases we have. Because when we are feeling angry and upset with our loved ones, part of that is that we have been conditioned to see addiction as a moral failing. And so we are very judgmental. We often talk about at meetings. I'll bring up to family members and say, what if your loved one had cancer? And people start to understand that we're all part of us is our social conditioning. It's a large part of us, and we have grown up in a culture where if you are struggling with addictive behavior, that's a character flaw. And so we have to first and foremost educate ourselves about addiction, understand that it's not about judgment, that it's about compassion, and get to that place. So that's a big challenge. And so that I would say that's a starting place. We have to turn the anger into some kind of real compassion in order to move forward. You can't be supportive of a loved one if you're sitting in judgment as opposed to feeling compassion. So that's really, really, really an important foundation.
Yeah, there's also anger, but I think the basis of that anger is fear.
Yeah. I think that's the other part of it, is recognize that we get stuck in how to move forward because we're just overwhelmed by that fear. And in fact, we have a tool in Family and Friends we use called the fear exercise. Mm-hmm. What it is, and because we are a tool-based program, basically it's not just about coming to meetings and talking about what the issues are. We're about what tools do we use for our own emotional self-management in order to get to that part where we're strong enough to really be connected to our loved one. Taking care of ourselves, that's always number one, but moving towards saying, okay, I can't control the outcome, but what can I do to make it better? And really, what does that mean? That means, how do I make the relationship with my loved one as healthy and strong as possible? And in order to do that, it means I have to be coming from a place like we use the oxygen mask, like on the airplane,
Mhm.
put your own mask on, and then let's figure out what do we need to do. And then that always takes us, of course, to the boundary issue, and we spend a tremendous amount of time talking about the establishment of healthy boundaries. That's probably the hardest thing. And this is just based on my experience. The hardest thing most people have with the whole fear thing, because, we get stuck. In our head, we know for example, have to set a healthy, acceptable boundary with a loved one, but we're so terrified that if we set this boundary, our loved one is going to be in worse shape than if we didn't do it. And that's kind of getting absolutely stuck in that fear syndrome. And so part of our the work we do helping facilitate the meetings is to help the participants help each other to figure out how do we do this, how do we stay clear and with setting those boundaries and maintaining them. And one of the things that we always do is remind ourselves that those who are in early recovery and later tell us over and over again that the fact that their family members were willing to set appropriate boundaries and keep them was a huge, huge part of their ability to find recovery. And I think we can't remind ourselves about that enough. In other words, they're not going to like it when you set the boundary, because you're dealing with a person who's struggling with addiction, and addiction is what's important. So they may be very angry, and usually are. And we talk about you're going to get blowback, but let's keep our eye on the ball. Long term, what's the goal here? And we do know that when we are really good at setting boundaries, it's a positive motivator for our loved ones. Now, no guarantees. We can do all the right thing. We still don't have control, but we know it's a tremendous, tremendous of importance to be able to set boundaries. So we spend a lot in our handbook. Actually, that's the only topic we spend 2 chapters on is boundaries.
By far the hardest thing to do.
Yeah,
I think especially for parents.
Yeah. But it is just a real struggle for people to overcome, as you say, that fear. That's a large part of it, and the boundary setting, it reflects that. I like to use in my meetings, and I think it's a very popular go-to book, the book Beyond Addiction. Comes out of the CRAFT program, which is a great deal. A lot of our tools are very similar. We've learned a lot about the research that's been done on the CRAFT therapy program in that book, and I'm paraphrasing here. But I think they have the best really definition because I called the word enabling the E word. I'm not a fan that. I think that it's been used just like we call people addicts and alcoholics. We call family members enablers. And I think it really does pathologize love and care. And so I really don't even like to use the word. So what I use instead is basically paraphrasing what that book says, is we look at our behavior and we need to ask ourselves a very simple question. Is my decision to go forward with whatever behavior I decide on, is it something that's encouraging the addiction to continue or maybe get worse? Or is it something that is possibly giving my loved one the natural consequences that may motivate them to work towards recovery? And if we keep it on that kind of road, that kind of path, and stop worrying about we're being enabling, and we just look at the reality of what will the outcome likely be of what we're doing, we've got an answer. People come into meetings and say, well, I'm so afraid, I'm enabling, I'm doing this and that. And then we just focus on the question. What do you think? What and it's very easy 99% of the time for people to reach a decision and understand it because they're looking at the consequences of their decision rather than getting caught up in the label. So it's a lot of work in terms of boundary setting and decision making.
It sure is. And what do you say to people? Because I'm sure you encounter people who say, I'm not the one with the problem. Why do I have to do all this work? Right? It's like they're the ones with the problem, not me. Just playing devil's advocate here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say that probably a great number, if not, I don't know if it's the majority, but certainly a great number of people when they first come to meetings absolutely feel that way.
Mhm.
They come to a meeting feeling that they're kind of at their wits' end. They don't know what else to do, but they don't see it in terms of them having to make changes. They see just their loved one having to make changes. So I think that's a really legitimate question. What happens is as people attend meetings and use the handbook and see the tools, they start to understand that they haven't done anything wrong. They haven't caused their loved ones, behavior, but they understand that they have choices about how to handle this. And I'm very kind of philosophical about this. I talk a lot about the fact that there's a difference between pain and suffering, and that we all have pain in life. There are things in life that bring us pain. That's just life, And in this situation, it's a loved one who's struggling with addiction. But unfortunately, as human beings, we tend to create suffering in our response to that pain. And so I think that in the big picture, that a real goal of our meetings is to help people with that. In other words, to understand that no one's going to make the pain of this go away, but you have the ability to not create additional suffering because of it.
Story, right? It's the story behind the pain, right? Or it's the story we tell ourselves about what's
Yeah.
going on and what we make it mean, right?
Yes. And it's our reaction to what the pain that we have and how we're dealing with it that it's creating most of the suffering. I mean, really at its heart, suffering is kind of a misunderstanding of reality. Things just are, and sometimes things that are painful. But if we understand the reality, and it goes back to what I said at the beginning, about understanding addiction, about understanding where our loved one's coming from, and we've developed compassion, we're able to see that it's not something our loved one is doing to us. That's the place where people are at when they first start this journey. Why is my loved one doing this to me? If my loved one loved me, they wouldn't choose to do this.
Right.
And then it's moving towards understanding, no, this is just happening. This is something your loved one is involved in that really has nothing to do with you. And in fact, if you listen to those who have reached recovery, you'll hear those stories over and over and over again, that actually they felt a great deal of guilt during the time that they were active users, and that and again, that may have even heightened their urges and their going to their substance. But on the other hand, that's not the fault of the family member. That is, but what we learn as family members is, if that's true, if that our loved one really at heart feels guilt during this, then what can we do? What can we do to examine our behavior to say, do we enhance that guilt? by the choices we make and what we say to them and what we do? Or do we develop some compassion for the fact that even though they aren't choosing recovery at this moment, or haven't been successful with recovery, that we can make things better if we recognize that, yeah, they're not doing this to us, they're just doing it. And that's a huge step. And I can't really stress enough that people who stick with the learning, okay, and practice, you can read about the tools, but for the people who come and practice the tools and really make changes in their life, it is life changing. They are so far different in terms of how they approach the situation with their loved one than when they came to their first meeting. That it's really, sometimes truthfully, it's even after 10 years, sometimes astounding to me, how much change people can make by really, this is a self-help. I mean, we have facilitators. I'm a facilitator, and we facilitate the learning, but it's the work and the encouragement and the support they get from one another that brings them along on this journey of change that is sometimes just astounding, really astounding.
And that spills over to all of their life, right?
Yes. Oh, yes.
It,
Yes. We have people who always talk about and even bring up examples in meetings of how the tools help them in the workplace, in other relationships, with their in-laws, with their friends, because they are life-changing tools. It's a way of approaching, again, smart self-management and recovery training. And it's all about how do we understand what's going on with us emotionally, our responses to the situation, and how do we manage? How do we manage those things? People will come to a meeting, let's say early on, and get very upset and say, like, I'm entitled to be angry, and they did this and they did that. And part of my response is usually something along the lines that, you're entitled totally to feel angry, but now what do you want to do with it? It's not about not being able to feel it or repressing it, but we want to choose to interact with our loved one and everyone really in ways that are helpful. And anger is not helpful. The expression of it in negative ways is not a helpful way in which to build a relationship and to be helpful. And I think that's huge. That's really huge. You're really exchanging anger. Well, I should say it the other way around. You're really exchanging compassion for anger. And that spills over into life because, hey, everything. You could be having a conflict with a coworker, but once you can have compassion for their point of view or understand where they're coming from, you can figure out ways in which to manage your own upset in ways that are more constructive. And that's the goal.
it's too bad no one ever teaches us this as kids, really, how to it's a worthwhile thing to teach how to regulate your emotions. And
Yes.
we can't teach our children because we never learned it ourselves, right? And it's just like we have to take this terribly negative situation and use it as, so it's really a beautiful thing to say, wow, look at what this came of this, right? Like we have this terrible adversity and so much growth comes from it. So
Yeah,
there's
that's
a lot
true.
of hope there,
Well,
really.
there's a great quote by Thich Nhat Hanh.
Mhm.
It says something like, "Without mud, there would be no lotus."
Right.
And I think that's really very, very much the truth. That it's from, however hard it may be to understand, that from pain and suffering can come an enormous opportunity for growth. And really, it's challenging. It requires a lot of hard work, but it's definitely doable, and it just blossoms into so many positive things. So
It sure does. It sure does. And that's definitely what I'm learning, especially having the opportunity to meet so many amazing people in recovery themselves and seeing the amazing things that they're doing, and turning it all around. It's really been a beautiful thing and
and,
so
and, I,
inspiring for me.
and I'll tell you that because you mentioned rightfully so that it helps in all relationships, not just a loved one, that in the situations where, and of course it comes up all the time, where let's just say a typical example would be a couple and a loved one, someone's been working very hard at making changes and reaches a point where their loved one is not going to choose recovery, at least not at this point, and that person decides to separate or leave the relationship, which of course is not unusual. But the beauty of all of this is that even when that, I have seen instances where, because of what they've learned to make that break, be it temporary or permanent, in a way that's so much more compassionate and so much more, so I'm going to use the word healthy in terms of ongoing relationships and health for both themselves and their partner. So even when recovery doesn't become the hope, that's the hope for everybody wants that. That's what they want. They want their loved one to recover. But sometimes that's not going to happen. And when that doesn't happen, there still are ways in which these tools really make that parting much more I don't know if the word's easy, but definitely less stressful, less less ongoing conflict.
Right.
We've had participants in our meetings over the years who come to meetings even after that happens, and have been able to develop a more positive um, uh, after the divorce kind of relationship, if that's the way to put it. So there's nothing to be lost in terms of a family member who works at all of these tools and learning this approach, because no matter what choice their loved one makes or doesn't make, their life is still going to be better. And I think that's the distinction between smart and what the more traditional approach to addiction still is. I mean, I know things are changing, but it is a slow process.
It sure is. It takes time. Can I ask you a question, Kathy?
Yeah.
There's this prevalent belief, and it's just not even in the addiction space. I'm just saying, for parents in general, I can only be as happy as my unhappiest child, right? I mean, there's so much of this, and that's a deep-seated belief in a lot of people. So my child is suffering with because of addiction or whatever, what they're going through. How can I possibly be happy?
Yeah, I'm not a fan. I do know it's very prevalent. I do know that, of course, I understand the feelings behind it. It is very painful, very painful. But that at heart becomes really a boundary issue. At some point, as again, it's a difference between pain and suffering. There's nothing I can say to you. If you feel this way, there's nothing I'm going to say to you to relieve you of the pain of having a child who's not happy. That's going to be a pain that isn't, at the moment anyway, going away, and it's something you have to deal with. But where the suffering comes in is when you buy into the idea that there's no way I can personally find peace or happiness because my child's unhappy.
Right.
And that's the struggle, because it is the distinction that is so important. No one's going to make it. I sometimes joke in meetings and say, nothing I say here, I'm not going to say anything that's going to make you jump up and say, oh, yippee, I'm so happy this happened to me. That's not what it's all about. No one's going to erase the pain. Right. But I see that statement which is widely accepted as a way in which we contribute to people thinking that, nope, if my child doesn't have peace and happiness in their life, then I can't. And that's, you know, I know I'm not a fan, as you probably already gathered, of kind of the jargon and
Mhm.
the labels, but I'd say in the traditional field, they would call that enmeshment, meaning
But
that
the
we,
definition of codependency too. Yeah.
well, yeah, I'm not a fan of that
Yeah,
word
I
either,
know. Yeah, I know you don't like the label either.
but I really am not, because I just think they become labels, but it is really basically, overstepping, even though they're our child, we are still separate human beings. And yes, you're not going to go through your life being happy that your child's unhappy. But there's a difference between that and saying, I can't have any personal peace or happiness of my own because that is a pain in my life. And I think that's something I don't know where that came from originally, how that got started as sort of a cultural meme. This whole
Expectation as a parent. I mean, it is huge. But what I see in that is, how is my misery going to help? If
yeah.
I'm miserable because you're miserable, how is that making anything better? You know what I mean? I think we need to work hard to bring ourselves to a more joyful place somehow, or at least peaceful place.
Yes.
And we can be a better example by
Yes.
doing that work. And how can anybody be happy around me if I'm miserable, right? It's contagious. It's like a downward spiral.
I honestly think it started on some talk show or something quite a long time ago. Really, I do. I'm not joking. Where this whole idea that that's a legitimate thing, that don't, in fact, you shouldn't be happy if you have an unhappy child. Somehow it's your responsibility to take responsibility for their unhappiness. And I think that's very destructive.
It
Uh,
really is. It really, really is. And I think that's really adds to this problem. And that's a
yes,
big piece. And that's a cultural piece.
yes,
But
yes,
that's
yeah.
let's
We
go.
we have, we have a lot of kind of undoings to do when we have to deal with a loved one struggling with addiction. And by that, I mean that we're trying to behave in ways that are kind of contrary to our DNA, meaning that, I think some of the neuroscientists have dubbed it something like we have modern uh, modern minds, but a caveman brain or something like that. But in other words, we're kind of programmed in our DNA to be reactive. It explains things like road rage and all of these things. And people, we kind of are trapped in that. And so we have to use the modern mind to figure out ways to behave in ways that our brain hasn't, or our DNA hasn't really caught up to. And I really do believe that. I think that we're kind of running counter to a lot of things that, it just seems to be, and it worked originally. Think about a more primitive time in humankind,
Mm.
where it was important to be emotionally reactive because life and death, was at stake. And so I think we still have that sort of biology DNA in us that makes us have to consciously work at figuring out ways to manage our reactivity, our emotions, in ways that are really more helpful to our life. That's one thing. The other thing is exactly what you're talking about. Like, somebody used this expression and I've taken it because I love it. I won't credit it because I don't remember it. Some scholar who said that basically we're a bunch of atoms made up of genes and memes. And so I love that, because basically it's the DNA, what we're programmed for. And then the memes are the kind of stuff like you're talking about, like I can only be as happy as my unhappiest child. We're socially conditioned to think in certain ways. And so we have to examine those things and say, well, is that true? And is that healthy, like you said? And what does it accomplish to say, I can't have any happiness if I have an unhappy child? One of the things that we talk about in our meetings sometimes that's, not a tool, but there's these other big, what I call big picture things that we have to sometimes focus on. And one is that if you are looking for some peace and happiness in your life, you better darn make friends with uncertainty, because life is totally uncertain. Be it whether our loved one is doing well today, next week, a year from now, 10 years from now, we have no control over all of those things. And if we can't accept that life is nothing but uncertain and nothing but change, then that peace and happiness has to be elusive. There's just no way to reach that without accepting uncertainty. And every meeting that I do is really, someone is really in the situation where they're predicting the future. They're sure because the loved one had a lapse that it's all over, nothing's going to ever change, and so on and so on. And people get stuck in this kind of thing about, labeling things as change. Whatever's happening in the moment is now what's happening forever. And that's not true. And we don't know what's going to happen. That's just what is happening now. And one of the things I like to say when people are stuck in that kind of thinking is that the beauty of the fact that everything's changing and nothing is permanent, okay, means that there's never a reason to be hopeless, ever. You can't go with hopelessness, which is a lot of families can get prone to do with this, having to wrestle with this painful situation. But you can't go there if you really understand that things are impermanent, uncertain, and we don't know the future. And then there's never a reason to be hopeless. It's just not possible. So these are really things that people wrestle with, and it takes time, work, patience, fortitude,
Practice and practice and
practice, and keeping your eye on the ultimate goal, because sometimes we have to make, as family members, painful and frightening decisions that are made because we're looking at a long-term goal, and we know that sometimes it may go our way and it may not, but otherwise, if we don't do it, we're just stuck, and being stuck that's not a good place to be. To just feel overwhelmed with fear and stuck in where we're at.
And it is the story, especially. I was reminded of something I read by Glennon Doyle, and it was brilliant, about the whole parenting thing and being unhappy if our child's unhappy. I think she said that puts an enormous amount of responsibility on our children to make us happy. It's not their job. And they don't want that responsibility. They know we're putting all of that on them. Our happiness is their job. I think that's too much for a child to bear. It really
or anyone we love to bear, because what we're doing,
especially a child.
Yeah, and what we're doing is we're basically adding a little bit more to their emotional burden by making them feel that they're responsible for our happiness.
Right.
In fact, I will say that many participants have talked about the fact that their loved one told them that when they got involved in coming to SMART meetings and taking better care of themselves, it was a huge relief to them.
Yep.
That part of their problem, was what we talked about earlier, this whole thing of feeling guilty. And so once they saw their family member not overwhelmed and focused on their addictive behavior, they could take a deep breath and not feel that sense of responsibility you're talking about. And that's a huge gift. That's a gift you're giving yourself, but the added bonus is you're giving the gift to your loved one as well.
Yeah, it's not anybody's job. No.
No.
So, my goodness. Well, you are, I could talk to you all day.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if that's good or bad. That may mean I'm talking too much.
Oh, no, you're very interesting. So before we wrap up, I just would like you to tell us a little bit more about SMART, how we are most of the meetings online. How do we find you?
Okay, well, SMART, of course, is as every organization, very easy to find online. Smartrecovery.org.
There'll be a link beneath this video. There'll be a link to it right beneath, but yeah.
We're at a very interesting time in our growth. We have face-to-face meetings out in the States and Canada. Actually, there's a international SMARTs as well, where there are in the community face-to-face meetings. But we also are growing a lot in terms of the online. Part of that was the COVID. Because face-to-face meetings shut down during COVID, and so our online grew. And very recently, we're actually right now in the throes of converting a lot of meetings to what we call national meetings, and we're getting more and more and more people online to attend meetings. So people can go online. They've made it pretty user-friendly now, and I'm not a tech person. Where you can go on and you can find meetings either face-to-face or online in your area. And it's very simple, and it's a way to get connected to what we do. Again, I mentioned at the beginning, the foundation is the rational and motor behavior therapy, and our tools grow from that. But basically, everything that's done in terms of SMART is done with the eye towards, what do we know is the best out there now in terms of addiction? Evidence-based things, talking about change. We know we can talk today, and 10 years from now, we'll know more and we'll know different things. But based on what we know to date, what's the best approach, both to the recovery side and to working with families. And I think I mentioned we have a handbook, which, people could get independently, but I'm a big, supporter of how important those meetings are, because reading a book and reading the tools, although may be helpful and expanding our understanding, it's really doing the work of being with other people who understand what you're going through. I always say to people, the details are different, the issues come up the same over and over and over again. And that is true. Each individual's family and personalities and, situations have different facts, but they still are going to go back to some of the stuff we talked about. It's going to go back to compassion. It's going to go back to self-care. It's going to go back to setting boundaries, working with our fear, so that the being able to do that and process it and hear others in a meeting, it's just really, really helpful.
Community, so important. You don't have to go through this alone.
Right. And it's that connection that helps people understand that others are doing it, they can do it, and it gives them that ability to, I call it like almost a reclaiming of themselves, that they've reached us at a point. That's probably my only, if I could wave a magic wand, okay, and change the nature of how all of this goes, probably way up at the top of my list would be that people get to us earlier, because often family members will get to a meeting and they are really, really overcome with anger, frustration, um, and it would really make things so much easier for them and their loved one if they got to the meeting earlier in the situation, where because what happens is when you get frustrated and you're angry, all that's happening is your relationship with your loved one is deteriorating. It's getting more and more damaged. And so not that it's impossible to reclaim it, but it just makes the work more painful and harder and longer. So my wand would be, as soon as the struggles begin, come to a meeting.
Early intervention. Well, that's that whole disease thing. It's just like, well, do you want to wait to stage 4 cancer, or do you want to get it at
Yep.
stage 1?
I
Same
think
thing.
part of the challenge is how do we get people earlier? And again, part of what we're working against is this still traditional, kind of information and philosophy about addiction that's still out in the culture. Even, the other extreme of it is, what do you see on TV? You see families dragging their loved one to an intervention, even though we know that by and large, what happens is you're pushing someone and putting them in a corner. The choice for recovery isn't theirs. And it just doesn't go anywhere, or it goes somewhere very temporarily and we're back again. So, I think that it's just, working against those kinds of traditional mindsets that make it difficult to get people early on. Like you said, they come to a meeting thinking, I'm here to fix my loved one. I'm not here to fix anything about how I approach it. So I think, it's going to be an ongoing struggle. But I have to say, in 10 years, there has been progress.
Yeah. And that's conversations like these, and that's why I feel so inspired to do this, and hopefully we can reach more people this way by
Yeah,
letting them know.
yeah, that's great. And kudos to you for doing it. It's wonderful.
Yeah, it chose me. I did not choose it. Trust me. Great. That's beautiful. Oh, the other one thing I wanted to ask you about SMART. Now, what another thing that might make you different from AlAnon is that AlAnon is pretty much just about the drinking, about alcoholism, but you seem to encompass all addictive behaviors.
We've had participants who have a loved one who have an addiction to video games, any maladaptive behavior. It's addiction is addiction.
Mhm.
And I think the difference is that to be fair, I think a program like Al-Anon's goal is to help people take care of themselves better, which is a really legitimate goal. What makes us different is our approach doesn't stop there.
Right.
It's not about just, in our view, the evidence is there that cutting off your loved one and allowing this or pushing this rock bottom idea is totally not the route. So that, yes, we very much are in line with the self-care, but that's, I think, the
That's
difference.
just the beginning. That's just the beginning. It's such an important thing that, yes, we will. There's the movement, the family recovery movement. That's what we're doing here. We're getting this information out to people because a lot of people really need to hear it. And
And I'm happy that you're doing, someone has agreed to be interviewed from Craft, because that's, that, like I said, we're really very much in line with that.
Yeah.
I always tell participants when they come and they're first learning about SMART, I say, well, in the family and friends here at SMART, we are kind of a marriage. We've got our REBT tools and everything that's done, because we use the same tools as they do in recovery meetings. But to that, we add what we've learned from Craft and what's out there. So I call it sort of the marriage of those two things.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so I'm very excited for that to have Carrie Wilkins will be speaking
That's
to that, so that'll be good. Well, thank you so much for the beautiful work that you're doing and for your service.
you've
It's
quite
wonderful.
a yeah, you've got quite a goal here, and I think that's terrific. And if there's any, if anything comes up that you have a question about that I haven't answered, or you need information that I may not know, I can get it for you.
So,
But about SMART,
mhm,
really,
mhm.
really been a pleasure to talk to you, or at least to hear me.
No, you are just a wealth of information. It's been beautiful. It really, really has. I learned so much, and it's very, very good. And I hope we have lots of people watching this
I,
benefiting from your wisdom. It's beautiful. Thank you so much.
and good luck with all of it.
Thank
Sounds.
you.
Bye bye.